Recently, while reading the front section of the Globe and Mail, I opened the centerfold and saw a page of pictures all exhibiting makeshift memorials in Quebec City. Pictures of handwritten signs expressing la paix, l'amour et la solidarité, hashtags stating all humans, one stating it won't divide us, and another that had the 6 names of the men who were killed in the shooting on January 29th. The article posted below those 12 images of a traumatized community was called "We Are Not Immune," and it was written by Adrienne Clarkson, the 26th Governor General of Canada. Clarkson's article is a reminder to its readers that Canadians are not immune to the opinions and actions of our neighbors to the south. We are not immune to see the ugliness and to hearing the appalling messages, even if we know them to be untrue, to be false, to be lies. We still hear them. The article went on to describe many of the actions and ideas that Canada has been not immune to over its long history. Actions such as turning Jewish people away, people who sought refuge right before World War II. Similarly, turning away Sikhs in the early 20th century when a ship of 376 passengers arrived in Vancouver, British Columbia, but only 24 people were allowed to disembark onto Canadian land. Or the actions of exiling Japanese Canadians into the interior of our country, taking away their human rights, confiscating their property right after Japan entered World War II. And, of course, the country's continued disregard of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Clarkson stated, "This country has always had to fight against prejudice and short-sightedness, and we continue to do so. The health of our society means that we have to continue to do so. We must never become complacent and think that we are better than anyone else because our country just happens to be a place where you can't buy an assault weapon down the street, or where everyone carries a pistol in their glove compartment. We must remember that we are not immune to racism and from taking away human rights." Adrienne Clarkson has an intimate knowledge of how susceptible to racism Canadians can be. She immigrated from Hong Kong to Canada in 1942 when she was 3 years old, and hers was the only family of Chinese descent on that Red Cross ship traveling across the Pacific Ocean. She explained that at the time that she arrived, Canada was still operating under the Chinese Exclusion Act, which discouraged the immigration from countries that were not white, and particularly to the Chinese. But when they arrived, they were granted passage into Canada, where they moved to Ottawa and where she has been a citizen of Ontario ever since. We can see from recent events that we have not been immune to the threats of racism, fear, hatred, and violence. It would be nice to believe that the actions that took place on January 29th in Quebec City were an isolated situation. It would be easy to blame them on the extremism and radical shifts that have begun south of our borders. But Canada has a long history of these situations, sometimes done by individual people, and sometimes done by the government. I've spent the last several years studying the Canadian history of colonization, or more specifically, the creating of Treaty Number 7, which was the treaty land of Calgary where I lived for more than 18 years. But I have also been learning about the so-called discovery of Canada as well. Stories told of the many Europeans traveling to this continent, settling, looking for a better life, attempting to escape poverty and persecution, often for their religious beliefs. Refugees escaping across the water is and was a very common practice. And while many who traveled across the Atlantic Ocean were refugees, there were mere passengers on exploration voyages. Many of these explorations were in search of a way to China. One such explorer, Martin Frobisher, tried to get to China by traveling across northern Canada. But there were only a few months each year that a ship could pass because the ice buildups. Many of the explorers didn't make it. Some died trying. And Martin Frobisher almost did, too. He was very lucky to make it to Newfoundland before the ice closed in his exit route. And the Aboriginal people that first met him gave him and his travelers fish and traditional bread. In Newfoundland, Frobisher held a formal ceremony of Thanksgiving to celebrate their safe passage. But alongside these stories of safekeeping and collaboration, there are also stories of terror and trauma, like those of residential schools that were developed all over this country. Schools where students were taken away from their families, sometimes, yes, with their parents' blessing, but more often than not, against their parents' will. And they were taught how to be civilized members of society, taught to read from a Bible and taught to pray the Lord's Prayer, taught that they were dirty or that they would have to they would become clean through these lessons. One of the things that I keep finding over and over again in these stories that I read is at about this time of residential schooling, but also about the stories of first contact that were made, was that they were often times of excitement, times of thanksgiving, and times of joy. But somewhere along the way, the relationships started to deteriorate. The differences were more dramatic than the similarities were connecting. This trope can be seen played out in time and time again. A trope is a storytelling device that often offers a shortcut for describing a situation that an audience would readily recognize. So if I were to say star-crossed lovers, immediately ideas and images would enter your head and you would automatically know the type of relationship that I was talking about. The same would happen if I said fallen hero, right? So all of these stories about the history of Canada suggest to me a new trope that we need to add to our consciousness. A story of welcoming strangers, inviting them in to participate in our community and engaging them up to a certain point, and then ostracizing them. Stories like Clarkson wrote about in the Globe and Mail article, or like the story of excluding Aboriginal peoples to their reservations and requiring them to stay or to lose their status. And these stories are not all in our long ago past. They are continued stories about this struggle, stories about refugees coming to Canada, and after 1 year of financial support, they are still unable to find work. They are unable to find adequate housing, and for some of them, they are unable to speak English because there are not enough opportunities to learn it. Stories of migrant families living here for decades, becoming welcomed into a community and becoming full citizens of Canada, and then being attacked and killed in their house of worship. We are not immune. Canada is not immune. Canadians are not immune. So how do we change this trope? How do we change this idea that there is a celebration for the newcomers and then we come to disregard, disengage, or even disgust one another after the honeymoon phase is over? How do we overcome our very human tendencies to extricate ourselves from situations that are uncomfortable and hard in order to maintain our own self-comfort? How can we do better and stop the story before we become disenchanted? A November 2015 Maclean's article captured an interview between a journalist and the Calgary mayor, Nahed Nenshi, describing Syrian refugees. The journalist, Aaron Wary, asked of Nenshi, "In another interview, you said, 'I think the way we manage ourselves over the next several months will really be defining for us as a nation.' First of all, what specifically did you mean by that? What about the next few months is going to be determinative?" Nenshi responded, "What I specifically mean is how we welcome the refugees when they arrive. We are going to have a whole bunch of new Canadians, and we are going to probably have 1,000 new Calgarians, and we have to make sure that when they get here, we give them every possible fair shake they can have to live a great life." Nenshi goes on to talk about how the City of Calgary council members had begun to work with its citizens to determine how they were going to house and employ the many new people that would arrive in their city. He also goes on to describe a meeting that he had earlier that morning. He said, "I had a meeting this morning where we had a community forum on refugees. And I was a little bit nervous walking in because it was an open invitation. Anybody could come. And I thought that there might be some angry people or people with a lot of really difficult questions. And who was there were churches and synagogues and temples and mosques and grandmothers and volunteers and people from all across the community who were just asking me the same question: how can I help? And at one point, a First Nations woman stood up. I only knew this because she said, 'I am a First Nations woman.' And I thought she was going to say, 'Why are we having all of this focus on these refugees when we have so many problems closer to home?' But what she actually said was, 'I need some help because I need to understand how and when these people are coming, because I want to make sure, and many of my First Nations colleagues want to make sure that these people, when they come, we have an opportunity to have the elders there to drum them in. We want to do a smudge ceremony so that they will feel welcomed on this land.'" And then she says, "I almost lost it at that point." This simple action, one that speaks of love and one that speaks of justice that is yet unrealized, this is where we need to go. This is where we break down those tropes, and this is how we change the ending of that story. Although the news article written by Adrienne Clarkson reminds us of some of Canada's worst ideas and decisions, Clarkson finishes her article with this statement: "Sometimes systems are not enforced. Sometimes they are neglected, and sometimes people benefit from that. Canada has always been a country where we are able to adjust. We must always be a country that understands that other people have brought different stories and different narratives to this country. We must respect their stories as we ask them to respect ours. And above all, we all belong together. We are one family. May it be so, and may we make it so."